at Department of Informatics, Universitas Islam Indonesia. Our topic for today's workshop is Identity Federation for Research and Education Network. And the title in the slide, Identity Access Management, it's actually the same thing. The speaker is Mr. Mukhammad Andri Setiawan, PhD, and Ms. Linda Agustina. She is from the Board of Information System, Universitas Islam Indonesia. Before we start, let me explain how you can talk to us during this workshop. If you have any questions during the presentation, just write them to the chat room. And you can also ask directly to the speakers during the Q&A session using the raise hand feature, and then we will help you to unmute yourself. So let's start this workshop. Our today's main speaker is Dr. Mukhammad Andri Setiawan. Let me introduce him to you all. He holds PhD from the University of Queensland, Australia, and a master degree in communication software and networks from Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Now he is the Chief Information Officer at Universitas Islam Indonesia. He has been joining Universitas Islam Indonesia since 2003. Dr. Andri has over 20 years experience as an IT engineer. He said that he still has a passion for doing one, even though now he has a role as CIO. He is also working as an assistant professor and lecturer in Department of Informatics, Universitas Islam Indonesia. Dr. Andri has a lot of experience. He has lots of passion for improving the internet in the higher education network. He is now part of Indonesia Research Education Network, or IDREN committee. He is actively engaged with IT communities at universities networks across Indonesia and Asia Pacific. He is also the main contact of EduRoam in Indonesia. So if you are from other campus and your campus has not had the EduRoam connection yet, please contact Dr. Andri. He is now also serving as the head of training and community development. This is a subunit at IDNIC, or Indonesia Network Information Center. It is the National Internet Registry of the Republic of Indonesia. So our topic for today's workshop is Identity Federation for Research and Education Network. The term Identity Federation might not be a familiar term for many of you if you are not in the field of Identity Access Management, or IAM. Yet, I am sure you all have somehow experienced Identity Federation while using various cloud applications on the internet, and you don't realize that you are using it. So what is Identity Federation and how to configure it? So Dr. Andri, are you ready?
Right, sure, no problem.
Yeah, okay, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Mukhammad Andri Setiawan.
Right, thank you all. Good afternoon, everyone. So, first time for a workshop. Well, in fact, actually, this is kind of like a not so-called workshop and introductions, but we will still deliver some technical stuff for the workshop itself. But I need to mention about this one because today, probably I just put my disclaimer one first. That this is not a full workshop for the Identity Federations. Normally, it took like 2 or 3 days to complete a workshop. Right? My experience with this kind of workshops for the past, like I've been doing this with many teams from Australia, from Malaysia, Singapore, basically from Asia Pacific. Whenever we have this kind of workshop, it will take us like 3 days just to complete the workshops, right? So yeah, today we are going to talk about the Identity Access Management, Identity Access Federations. Like Fayruz mentions about this one. Probably some of you guys do not know the concept of the identity federations, but you probably already use the identity federations when you are accessing many things over the internet, right? The case that I'm going to talk today, it's we have the focus mostly on the research and educations area, and that's quite important because today we have a lot of competitions actually when we deliver about the identity access, right? For example, we have like many websites, they provide a Google login or social media login using Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on and so forth, right? So that's the competitor of the identity access. But in research educations, we have some different cases. Why do we need to use this kind of access federations? Right? So I'm introducing myself first, right? So my name is Andri. I'm the CIO of Islam Indonesia. Also at the same time, I'm the main contact of EduRoam Indonesia. And today I'm involved in the Indonesia Access Federations. We call the Indonesia Access Federation as Federasi. You can check the website. It's still a work in progress. The back end is already completed, but we have to promote. Just like EduRoam last time when we brought the EduRoam to Indonesia in 2016, 2017, there were nothing about the EduRoam, and we started from the scratch. And hopefully we do the same thing with the Indonesia Access Federations. So basically what we do is we manage the identity federations in the Republic of Indonesia. Usually in a country, there is only one access federations. Even though I know some countries, they have multiple identity federations. But mostly in most countries, they usually only have like one identity federations. And right now we are working hard, work closely with our colleagues from, especially from Australia, the AAF, Australian Access Federations. So the cooperation that we have is basically to make our federations accredited by international community, right? So the Access Federations currently is maintained by Universitas Islam Indonesia, and we have the historical background why it's maintained by Universitas Islam Indonesia. Right? I will talk about that one later on. So who is Indonesia Access Federations? Like I did mention, it's still work in progress. So basically the Indonesia Access Federation, or we call it Federasi, or Federasi ID, is a service for research and education network entities, including and not limited to universities, schools, and research institutes in Indonesia. That's users of those entities a seamless access to academic e-resources, for example, like library, e-library, journals, and everything else, cloud service providers, and other partners. To make things clear, an example of access federations, for example, if you access your, say, for example, Zoom account, like those from Universitas Islam Indonesia, you are familiar with the way you log in into the system with our URL uii.zoom.us, and then we log on into that system. Similar page, it's also applicable for accessing another platforms, such as Panopto for the video repository in the university. For other people probably from other countries, from Indonesia, like in Malaysia, Singapore, in Thailand, Australia, when you access journals, you will use your username and password from your university rather than accessing it from IP address. In Indonesia, if you access a journal, it's very common when you access the journals, it's coming, you need to be within the campus premise, right? So you need to be on site on campus, or you can use the VPN to access the library, right? It's very common thing happen in Indonesia, but it's not common outside Indonesia, right? Outside Indonesia, they just simply use the username and password given by the university or by the research educations, or sorry, by the research institutions when they want to access the journals. So that's one thing about the Indonesia Access Federation. Basically, we are the one that bridge the access from institutions to other institutions. So in regards to that, if I draw a diagram, so basically what happened is like this. So this is, sorry. Hey, my annotation doesn't work. Just put it here. Okay, so basically this is us. Oh, sorry. Annotations. I thought I already had the annotations. Okay, somehow the annotation doesn't work. I'll just use my PowerPoint. So this is us, the Indonesia Access Federations or Federasi. Basically, we connect two entities. The first entities are something called, say, for example, campus. I'll say campus, or probably university. And we have plenty of that one, campus, and universities. This is very common. We call it as IDP, identity provider. And then we connect them with the resources. This is something called e-resources. So for those you guys that you access the e-resources such as video conferencing like Zoom, or probably the video platforms such as Canopto, or probably e-learning, something called Moodle and everything else, we basically connect with those e-resources, right? So what happened is we bridge institutions to other institutions. So these e-resources could be like e-journals, for example, Science Direct, IEEE, EBSCO, and everything else. So that they don't have to deal with the identity one by one with the university, right? So they don't have to go with the University A, they don't have to go with the University B, they don't have to go with the University C. Instead of doing that, they just simply connect us, the Access Federation, just one connectivity, then they can connect to all the identity providers. So that's basically identity Indonesia Access Federations. Right, this is the disclaimer that I need to mention. This is not a full workshop, as normally it took 2-3 days to complete the workshop. What you'll get today are ideas and big pictures of how identity federation should look like, or how it looks like. But we still keep our promise to help you understand and how to deploy a complete identity management and also the federations, right? Okay, so let's start with the historical background. So let's start with the historical background. Why do we have these access federations, right? We've been with the EdgeRoam, global free Wi-Fi roaming access in 106 countries, available in more than 50,000 institutions since 2017, early 2017. The first institutions to connect EdgeRoam in Indonesia is ITB. ITB connected to the EdgeRoam in 2016. It was on October 2016, but nothing happened since. I mean, EdgeRoam has the ITB has the EdgeRoam, but it was not being socialized, no training whatsoever. And then Universitas Indonesia started to join the EdgeRoam on February 2017. So after like 5 months after ITB, UII joined the EdgeRoam, and then we had the discussions to promote more on the EdgeRoam. And what happened was, since then, UII, our own university, we took the lead on promoting EdgeRoam in Indonesia. Technically, it's still UII and also the ITB that work with the EdgeRoam, but all the campaign, all the tutorials, all the workshops were being delivered by Universitas Indonesia. We had a help from many of our friends from Australia with the ARNet, and then we also had a help from Radius. So there is something called a software called Free Radius. It's the most popular software for AAA authentications, authorization, and accounting across the world. So in many, basically almost, I can say like 60 to 70% of the remote access, dial-in access, it's provided by the Free Radius. It's a company based in Canada. We had a help from friends from Canada that help us to deliver all the training in Indonesia. So EdgeRoam, again, I need to mention, it's a free global roaming Wi-Fi. It's based on the WPA Enterprise, usually WPA2 Enterprise, something called 802.1x. So this is the base of EdgeRoam, 802.1x. Okay. These authentications means that you only need to authenticate once, and then you connect to the system afterwards. You don't need to insert, you don't need to input your username and password anymore after you enter the credentials. once you enter the credentials, you will be connected forever unless you reset the password. That's one thing. So the edge room, it's based on proxy authentications, and usually it has the backend something called a directory. So that directory will contain your username, also contain the password, right? And other part is also it also usually has something called like role or group or something like that, right? In our case, in our university, the back end that we use is actually Active Directory, right? Active Directory is a Windows base. So we are using the Windows server. And then we provide all the identity within Active Directory, right? In most cases, for higher educations, they prefer to use the Active Directory because usually they also use the Windows Server as a domain controller, right? So this Windows Server usually also act as a DC or something called domain controller, right? Using a domain controller, basically you can control all the PC, all the workstations when they connect to the system. So each of you guys can log into the machines using your own username and password. So rather than share the password or you put the password behind or put it on a screen, on an LCD screen, the password for this PC is XYZ, something like that. You don't need to do that one. You simply use your username and password. And how that can be done is basically you're using Windows Server as a domain controller. Since most machines is usually Windows-based, so it's normal for an organization to use the Windows Server, right? I'm not trying to force you guys to use the Windows Server, but because it's just natural. Since most machines in our university is also using Windows for the lab, for example, or for the workstation. So that's why we prefer to use the Windows Server as our domain controller. Domain controller can be, you can use Linux always. You can use something called Samba as a primary domain controller, something called PDC. But in our case, it's AD. And this is the most common one when you go to Europe, when you go to USA, you go to Australia. Most people will just simply use AD because you just buy the Windows Server for something like $2,000 US. It's a perpetual license. So you just buy once and then you can use it forever. Or if you want to use the subscription base, usually it just only costs you like $500 a year, something like that. So once you have this Active Directory, once you have all the informations, basically using an edge room, we get all the informations from the AD as the backend to authenticate a user into the network, right? So the way the edge room works is basically you will be authenticated first before you can connect to the network. Unlike many other authentications, like for example, the most common one is using captive portal in many places in Indonesia. Right? If you go to airport, if you go to the train stations, if you go to public Wi-Fi hotspot, they will ask you username and passwords once you connect to the network first. So you need to connect to the network, you get an IP address, you get a DNS and everything else, and then you will be authenticated afterward, right? But using the edge room, you won't get any IP address, you won't get any DNS, you won't get anything unless you are being authenticated to the system first. So it's basically a layer 2 authentications. Right. Since most edge room services in Indonesia and the world are backed by some identity services, there is a need actually later on. Can we use these authentications using Active Directory or OpenLDAP or some SQL database? Probably you use the PostgreSQL or MySQL or probably Oracle as the backend. And then we use the same resources to access something called e-resources. Edge room, you're basically accessing physical resources. So I just put PHY. Using edge room, basically you access a physical resources. You need to be, for example, in my case, if I visit Australia, say for example, I visit University of Melbourne, right? So I go to Melbourne, and then I'll just go to the northern part of Melbourne, and then I'll visit University of Melbourne. Once I'm in the university, inside the complex, inside the building of the University of Melbourne, my Wi-Fi will be connected automatically, right? It's thanks to edge room. So the authentications is sent back to Indonesia, to my university, to Universitas Islam Indonesia. And then once I got the thing authenticated in our university, it will be returned back to Australia. And then in Australia, the Wi-Fi system will acknowledge, okay, you are a valid user, you are authenticated user from Indonesia. Specifically, you are from Universitas Islam Indonesia. I'm giving you access to my Wi-Fi. So it's a physical resources that being shared, right? Once the edge roam, it went viral. So basically now almost every country has edge roam. The research and education community across the world, they started to think, because the way edge roam born. So basically edge roam was born because university, they work together as a community, right? So it started in Netherlands with the SurfNet. So if you go to Europe, it's very common, especially because it's EU. If you're in Europe, basically you don't see a border, right? You don't see a border. If you go from Netherlands to Germany, you won't see any border, like a post station, something like that. And then some guard has like a gun, to protect the border. No, you just walk into other countries, right? So it's very common for university, they work together, right? Before the edge room era, when they want to work together, there were some problem. Okay, I want to visit your university, and let's work together. But can you give me a Wi-Fi access? Can you provide me with some username and password that I can use, right? So that creates difficulty back then, and then edge room was born. So the similar situations actually happens, when they want to work together, thanks to the internet, thanks to the network, edge room was born in like early 2000. So it was long time ago, early 2000. It's almost like probably like 20 years. It's only like 18 or 17 years, but it was long time ago, right? Back in the day, internet was not like today, where you can get your internet fast. It's in tens or probably 100 of Mbps, the internet connectivity that you get. Today, internet is so fast, but back in the day, I still remember vividly when I started my experience with the internet in late 1990. So I started to use the internet in 1997, 1998. The download speed was like less than, the modem speed is only like 32 kilobit per second, kbps. It's not mbps, it's kbps. Very, very slow back in the day, right? So because the internet speed is so fast, and also the connectivity across universities is also big, like in Europe, they have fiber optic to connect from Norway to London with the speed reaching, if I'm not mistaken, like 400 gigabit per second, 400 Gbps to connect from Norway to London, right? That is the back end, right? So you can send all resources, the research, basically usually the data, any kind of data, open data that you share together to work for research, you will transfer it over the network. But the thing is, the data itself, it's something that should be protected. It's not publicly available. It's only accessible only for a researcher. So now they started to think, if we can provide collaborations with edge room, how can we provide collaborations with the e-resources that we have? We have all the data from satellite, for example, or we have the data from, like in Japan, when I had a chance to attend a conference in China, one colleague from Japan, they showed us a video of a paddy field, with the resolutions of 4K. That was in 2017. In 2018, they demonstrate that they stream 8K video for a paddy field. It's just a paddy field, but they put a camera, very high resolution camera, just to, as a research purpose. They want to observe how the paddy grows. Because Japan is just like any other East Asia or Southeast Asia countries. Mostly they eat rice, just like us from Indonesia, we also eat rice. So they provide the camera for research purposes, and they will send all the informations using the pipe that they have, right? And say, for example, I'm from Korea. I want to access the resources. How can I do that? So long time ago, we need to create a username and password in our server. Say, for example, I'm in Indonesia, I'm in Yogyakarta, I have a resources, e-resources, and my colleague, a university from, say, for example, from Australia, they want to access our data. They want to access our data. So what we do usually, we will just simply create a username and a password and then give it to them, right? And they can access the resources. That's how we've done it in the past. But the thing is, when your system grow complex, when your system getting complex, right? It's difficult to maintain. It's really difficult to maintain all of this kind of username and password. And for yourself as a researcher, for example, like if I have like only one university partner, it's easy to remember the username and password. But if you have 10, 20, 30 universities that work together with your university across the globe, and then it will be really difficult just to remember the username and password, because you will have like another 20 username and password. So that's why came the access federations. So how does it look like? Basically, most likely you've been using this one with something called single sign-on process. So the identity federations is basically almost the same as an SSO. You know, the old SSO is usually something like this. If you once you sign in into a system, then you try to, when you open another services from the same company, for example, if you open a Gmail on Google, once you open Gmail on Google, when you click YouTube, and then you click Google Docs, and then you open Google Spreadsheets, you open Google Slides and everything else, it will be linked. You don't have to log in anymore, right? That's something called SSO. That's why it's called single sign-on. You just simply sign on once, and then you can open many tabs from across different platforms, different applications. So the identity federation is basically a subset of the SSO itself. It has a functionality just like an SSO. It has a functionality just like an SSO, but we go further from just simply using an applications from your own organizations, or from the building up block of the applications. Just like in Google, they have the Google Stacks. Basically, they have all the Office's application and so on and so forth. If you open Microsoft, you open PowerPoint, you open Excel, you open everything else on the cloud. You just simply log in once, and then you can access all the resources. So the federations, the identity federations, is similar to that. The difference is you may access other resources from other university or from other research educations, or probably also from the commercial as well, right? Now, the thing is, why don't we use Google as our authentications? Isn't it that we can simply use Google? Yes, you can use Google as an OAuth 2 authentications, but we are not Google. Identity that we use is basically an enterprise-based system. Using a Google authentications, basically you authenticate yourself. That makes you allowed to access the resources. That's it. You have a resources, you log in using username and password, or if you use the Google, say for example, like it's very popular for a e-commerce platform in Indonesia, you just simply log in using Google account, right? You know, the startup in Indonesia like Tokopedia, Bukalapak, and everything else. If you want to access their services, you just simply log in using your Google account. Once you log in the Google and then click G, and then that's it, right? But with the research education networks, the situation is not like that. We don't simply do authentications only. Authentications is only our first step. Authentications is only our first step. The rest of the day, it will be authorizations. So basically, the heart of the identity, it's not on the authentications, but it's in the authorizations. Again, I repeat, the heart of the identity is not the authentications. Of course, I'm not basically saying that authentication is, you just can simply overlook, and then just simply doesn't care about the authentications. Authentication is still a big part, but it's only the first step before you enter into the machines, before you access into the resource. The next question will be, once you enter a system, now who can prevent you from accessing a data that you are not authorized to see, right? Say, for example, I'm the university, I'm providing you a guest with some data, okay? You are from New Zealand, from Auckland University, right? You want to access my data. I have a satellite data for Indonesia, right? And then you want to access it. But then you decide something like this. Okay, my colleague from New Zealand, he or she can download some data from the satellite, but not all. I've decided not to give all access. I will give access to many resources, but not all, because there is some specific resources that came from satellite. It's very sensitive data. I don't want them to access this sensitive data. You can't do that with the Google authentications, because Google authentication, simply put, is just simply authenticate yourself. It doesn't have something called like authorizations. Can I access the data? Can I use this data? No. So we are not Google. Identity is the one that's being used in the our organizations. As you can see, right over here, we have the identity provider. So the identity provider is basically your institutions, right? And then we have the service provider. Service provider is basically the one that provide you with the services, right? Like I mentioned, for example, I have the data. So this is UII. And then, for example, my colleague from Canberra, from ANU, he or she wants to access the data from here, right? So the process is, back in the day, I will set up a username and password in my system as a service provider. But today, it's no longer feasible to create, you have a memorandum of understanding, then you create a username and password. You need to create another username and password. You need to create another username and password again and again and again and again, right? And then by the end of the day, you cannot keep track who is actually using the services, right? So we have these identity federations that will manage all the connectivity, right? So people from ANU, when they want to access the system, the service provider, and then the service provider, this is the case of UII, will basically send it back, the request to the ANU. Okay, prove me that you are someone legitimate from ANU before you can access my resources. Again, I repeat, UII as a service provider will ask ANU, prove me, give me some proof that you are actually a legitimate user from ANU. And then the system will return back to the ANU, open with a login website. Once they open the website, they log in into their own website. I need to put a highlight here. So the authentication part, it's not happening in the UII. So it's not here. The authentication part, it's not on the SP. Of course, before you access the system, it will block you with some authentications. You need to log in before you can access our resources. But once you click a login, it will be redirected to the ANU website. So people from Australia, from Canberra, when they want to access the system, this system from service provider basically will return all the requests to ANU back. So now the next step, they will open ANU website, the login. Once you log in, it will be returned back here to our university. Okay, you already give me some proof that you are actually a legitimate user from ANU. I'll give you resources. Now think something similar with Zoom, something similar with Google, something similar with Moodle, with Panopto and everything else. In case of in our university, the service provider is, for example, Zoom. I'll just take Zoom as it's a good example. So the staff and students in our university, before they can access Zoom, they need to open an SSO, right? So on application, they can click SSO, or they can also open a website called uii.zoom.us. Once they click the uii.zoom.us, they click sign in. When they click sign in, basically all the authentication will be redirected to our university website. And then in the university website, they need to enter the username and password, right? Once they give the username and password, the identity provider, which is our university, will provide back to the Zoom with the information needed. For example, the first name, last name, email address, and then the role that they have in the university, whether they are allowed to access or not. An example is an alumni, they can authenticate themselves into our IDP, identity provider system, into our authentication system. Once a student graduated from the university, they will be in the alumni group, right? But when they try to log into Zoom, they will got rejected, because on Zoom, we already define only those still active in the university as a staff or as a students that can access Zoom. Once you are an alumni, you are no longer be able to access Zoom using the SSO, right? So that's what happened in the single sign-on process with this identity. So basically, what our goals is actually for the identity at research and educations. Basically, the dream is to provide users with a single login that grants access to any resources, irrespective of device or physical locations, right? So the focus here is basically, how can I give you the e-services? Remember, we have the Edge Room. In Edge Room, we provide you with the physical services, the Wi-Fi. So anywhere you go across the globe, in 106 countries, as long as your university, your research institutions is part of the Edge Room global network, you can connect anywhere across the world, right? So I went to Netherlands last year. I went to Vienna. I went to Melbourne. I went to Brisbane. I went to Auckland. I went to Singapore. I went to Malaysia. Everywhere I go, everywhere I went to the globe, my mobile phone, my laptop, and everything else simply got connected seamlessly, right? So now do the same thing, but not in the physical resources. We do it on the e-resources, right? So the identity, the heart of the identity, I need to mention again, it's all about how can you provide the services. And to have the identity to work as that, we need to think about the identity management first, right? So I mentioned about the identity management. I also mentioned about the federations. The management itself is basically how you deal with the identity. The federation itself, how you access the resources. So it's both almost the similar one, but it has a different functionality. In the identity management, it's good for example, SSO, or another one is for role-based access to the network resources. It's very common for a corporate to differentiate the access. If you are for example, board of directors, you are on the high side of in the organizations, you will access plenty of resources, and then you can use simple like that. Like in the case in my university, we have a portal for everybody, for students, for staff, something called UII Gateway. For some users, when they log into the system, they only see 1 or 2 applications. For me, since I'm the CIO of the university, I have plenty of applications shown in my screen. Even though we use the same login system, but once the login system is passed back to the application itself, it provides you with a different role, right? Also supporting for traveling scholars. Why do we need this one? Again, research and education. It's very common for them to collaborate each other's, and to make the collaboration seamless for the e-resources, then we need to provide with the identity, right? We also have the identity as the tool for collaborations, and we can share access some remote instruments. In fact, in some countries, they provide the university with the access to, for example, a high-performance computing server, right? I don't need to create like my own username and password into HPC, to access the server, but I simply use my username and password in my university to access the system. Okay. Right. So why focus on campus networks? I mentioned almost all. The first one is individual institutions are the authoritative source of the domain data. Think something like something very popular in Europe, something called GDPR, the General Data Protections Regulations, I'm not mistaken, GDPR. So long story short, basically you cannot have data. You can have data from people from EU, but if anything happens with the data, you are liable for the issue costs, right? For example, you have a username and password from your colleague from Europe, and then your system got hacked. And since the hack happens, the credentials and everything else, it was used by some hacker to access some illegal access back in the Europe, for example, financial institutions and everything else, right? Because you don't protect the data well, and then the hack happened, you can be liable. Say, for example, if your user, the one that from Europe, feel that this guy, he has my data, but he doesn't handle my data well, I'll sue them, right? So you can be liable for probably million US dollars or million euros because basically you neglect to protect the system, right? Something like that. So since the GDPR, now most organizations, they prefer to have something called like this. So you don't have to store all the credentials. Basically, the one that you probably need to use on the system is only your email and also the name. Like in the case in our university with Zoom, for example, this is an example with Zoom. Zoom only on its database, so Zoom has a database, of course, definitely. In the database, it has your name, and the other one, it has your email address. First, it has your name, and it has your email addresses, right? Zoom doesn't have other data with regards to some credential from our university. They only need two things, right? But the scenario, like I did mention, for us, an alumni cannot access the Zoom system. Students, active staffs, they can access Zoom, but not for alumni. So we need to provide the attribute, right? So we just simply define the attribute in the Zoom. Okay, who can access Zoom? Then we will put this attribute. Once Zoom authenticate with our identity provider system, it can check. Oh, it doesn't have. It has this. He is part of this group, the alumni. So he cannot access Zoom, and then we just simply reject the authentications. We can do that with the Zoom. We can do that with the identity access. Right. That's something. It's very common, right? So the individual institutions own all the data. So we don't. The service provider, like university, research institutions, and everything else, it doesn't have all the data that can, probably creating some leak, creating some troubles in the futures. We don't keep that data, right? So the campus network is the foundations for research and education activities, right? So basically, what happened is, in normal way, campus network is usually isolated network. It really is that network, right? But since the collaborations among campuses is really essentials, right? So they need to broaden their network, not only for their own institutions, but they also work with other institutions. So when the campus network grows, right? This is what happened. Like when staff and money are in short supply, any new effort must add value to the entire campus plan. So this is basically when the network is stuck, and we need to have collaborations. But another collaboration means another money that needs to spend. Why don't we just simply use some things that we already have? Something called identity, right? So we can have a better utilization of the data. We just simply enrich the identity. We simply enrich the identity to have some attributes that needed for this purpose, right? It's better security. Yeah, we don't need to keep all the username and also the password. That's the most important part. You as a service provider, you don't need to keep the username and password. Who keep the username and password? Other institutions that wish to access our services. Again, I repeat, you as a service provider, as the one that own the data, the research data and everything else, you don't need to keep username and password from people from other institutions. Let them manage their own identity, and then you just simply authenticate them into their own identity system. Once it got approved, and then, okay, I'll give you the data. So it's better management for security, better management for restricted resources, right? So the value itself is just not simply username and password, but it goes beyond the IDM. Make things seamless. It doesn't cost you with, you don't have to remember a lot of username and password. Again, remembering a lot of username and password is really, really difficult, right? So we see the identity management, it has a lot of service capabilities, right? It's the AAA, like I mentioned before. It has the authentications to verify who you are. It has authorizations, basically to what you can access, what can you access into the system, and also the administrations, the accounting. You can manage the user privilege by role, group, status, and everything else. I want to access this high performance computing. Who can actually access the high performance computing? Right? An example, something like this. This is actually happening in our university. In our university, some of the faculty, some of the department, they have their own system, right? So I just put this one as a system A. Okay. Another faculty, another department, it has another system called system B. Okay. And then this is the identity provider that we have, IDP. But in our university, we still provide with allows other third party to use the Google login. Right. So I just simply put this one OAuth from Google. OAuth from Google. Right. Both system A and system B owned by different faculties. OAuth and the IDP, it has the same backend. So it has the same backend, right? It has the same backend that contain username and password. That's what happened, okay? What is the difference between the IDP that we use the identity access on enterprise? So we use as basically enterprise-based identity access versus the OAuth 2. So what happened is in the system A, because it is using the OAuth 2, basically I have to define all my username A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So I need to put all the users before the system can actually, before user in the system can actually access the system itself, right? So it tried to log in using the OAuth. Again, I need to mention, this is not a very common thing happen in many universities across the globe. It's not only specific to our university, but I saw this in many universities. Even in Indonesia, it's many universities use this similar way of authentications. So what happened is I need to create all the username here, and then the authentication part is here. Okay. If you are not being defined here, you cannot access the system A. I repeat, if you are not in the list of the users, you cannot access the system A, because what happened is actually match between this guy, the OAuth 2, and also the system A, right? Using the identity, we don't need to keep this kind of data. Right? So if I have a database here, consists of all the usernames, for a system B, since it's used the IDP, it doesn't have similar database. So what happened is if I request an authentication from the IDP will return not only, okay, you are authenticated, you can access the system, but we can also request for an attribute. I will show you some example to give you a brief understanding of what kind of attributes actually look like, okay? So it can provide you with the attribute, for example, from which department are you from? Say, for example, a system B, it's only accessible from the Faculty of Business and Economics. That's an example. So in this Faculty of Business and Economics, it creates a system, and the requirement is I want only people from my department, from the Faculty of Business and Economics, and also the students that is registered for the faculty that can access the system. So like myself, I'm from the Faculty of Industrial Engineering. I want to access the system B. Even though when I log in into the system B, it will provide me with a login page, the one that's so similar with the one that I use for Zoom, the one that I use for email, the one that I use for my Panopto, the one that I use for my Moodle and everything else. I cannot log in into the system B. It will be rejected because I'm not from the Faculty of Business and Economics. So it's easier to set up for the system B rather than system A. System A is very complicated. I hope you can understand. Okay, this is the identity looks like. So think identity management like a network management, right? Think identity management like network management. If you are a network engineer, you already with a local policy, global transit as part of the job. So you will not allow unmanaged device on the network. So the situation is also similar with the identity. You will not allow an unmanaged device on your network while allowing unmanaged end users. So again, the focus here is we talk more about a user. We talk more about roles, right? User roles, authentications, authorizations, they're part of the integral part of any identity management, right? That's the integral part of the identity management. So it's not just simply allowing you to access the system via authentications, but it's also a lot of things that happen, right? So in the past decade, thankfully in the past decade, many research and education networks across the globe have seen a lot of progress in identity management. Now they started to have something called common standards. They have something called common software. Even the open source option, it's not plenty. We also have the common profiles, common practices and policies and everything else, right? So the research and education networks as a global network, right? It's really well developed, right? In fact, next week I will be joining another sessions with my colleague from Australia and also from Southeast Asia to discuss about this identity management, right? These firms, it has the training resources, special advanced on working groups, special advanced topic on working groups, and also the documentation is also best practices, right? Examples like Rivets, it's from EU, in common, it's in US, and also the EduGain operated by Jean, it's Interconnect Identity Federation across the world, right? So we are in progress of joining with the EduGain. Yeah, hopefully within 6 months, we'll be able to join them, right? So these are the toolbox for the identity. The first one is the authentication part, the most basic one, also the important one, authentications. You cannot go with the authorizations if you don't do authentications, right? In this case, we use Shibboleth, or we can use Chas from Apereo, or we can use the most common one and the most simple one, something called Simple SAML, right? In our university, we use Shibboleth. I know that some universities in Indonesia, they prefer to use CHAS, Central Authentication Services for SSO. It's from the Apereo website. But Shibboleth is not getting sections in more research and education network. So people from InCommon from USA, they prefer to use Shibboleth definitely because they are the one that actually developed the Shibboleth. In Europe, we see the shifting trend from Simple SAML to Shibboleth as well. In Australia, most of the university, they also use the Shibboleth, right? That's why in our university, we prefer to use Shibboleth, which is simply aligned with other universities across the globe, right? Even though we still can use Simple SAML or probably just for the purpose, right? This software, Shibboleth, CHAS, and Simple SAML, you just basically download from the internet. It's an open source one. I don't know about CHAS because it used to be open source, but now they changed the website to Apereo. Probably they still have the community versions, also the commercial versions, right? So once we have all this authentication, we started the identity management, right? There are few elements of few elements of IDM that's quite important. The first one is something called unique identifiers. It's basically the username, right? The UID, right? The UID. It's basically the username that you use to access the system. If you're using Microsoft base, it's not called UID. It will be called as SAM account name, something like that. SAM account name, right? The second part of the IDM is the directory. This is really important. I've seen plenty of universities in Indonesia, they don't use directory. Instead, they use the relational database like SQL. Even though it's okay, it's allowed to use the SQL, but it's not recommended for the identity purpose. Because for, now let's think about the database. For example, this is the table that I have. I have here username, I have here password. For that purpose, it's easy. Okay, done, username and password. But now I need to remind you, identity for authentications is only the first step. Authentications is only the first step. The next part will be authorizations. Now think about the role that you might have. Like myself, I'm a lecturer. At the same time, I'm the CIO. At the same time, I'm this, I'm that, I'm this, I'm that. So I have plenty of roles in the system. If you have a database, something like this, can you imagine how many columns that you need to have for a username to have multiple roles? Okay, I can split the database into something. Yeah, you can do that one, but still, it's not a natural. A directory is basically a special case of database. It is still a database, but it's a type of database because it has all the structures of the organizations. So it mimics organizations. They have the head of department, they have all this, they have all that, and then it mimics request with the directory. Right? You can learn more about this one when you learn about the LDAP. So directory is usually LDAP, right? And then you have the authentication part. Definitely, authentication is basically combinations of your username and password. Username is UID, and also the password, right? So the combination of username and password, basically the one that you need for authentication part, right? And the part that is quite also important is actually the federations, where we have something called identity provider. It usually wrote like this. We wrote IDP. And then we also use the SV, service providers. And then we also have the directory services. Usually we call it WAYF. Where are you from? Or we can also use something called discovery. This is in the federations. Now the deployment example, you just simply use LDAP, test, Kerberos, MySQL, or Shibboleth. Free. Yeah, and you can use anything as long as we learn about that one later on. As long as you have something called SAML. So make sure if you want to deploy the system, your system is SAML compliance. Your system is SAML compliant. Security assertion markup language. We'll talk about that one later. Right. So defining the identity. How do you define an identity? Basically, when you define an identity, it's usually based on the authorization part, right? When you define identity, again, I need to highlight, you don't talk about the username and password. Username and password is only simple thing, right? So I know that my students usually, when they talk about the identity on a system, what they think is username and password. I'm not saying it's not correct. It is correct, but it's only a small fraction of the system itself. In today's modern world, in the modern system, we no longer simply talk about the authentications. Most part, we'll talk about the policy, who can access the system, what kind of data that they can access, and so on and so forth. So we really need something called policy-based authorizations, where we can see the policy and also the method, what kind of services that you can provide for these particular users. And by the end of the day, we also talk about the privacy issue, security, and also the acceptability of the system, right? So the campus identity, it's not just simply this one, where it's, of course, it is important, but we talk more about this one: roles, entitlement, affiliations, group, privilege, policy, authority, delegations, and so on and so forth, right? For example, I can log into the system and I can access only a particular part of the system. Or if I cannot do that, someone can, I can simply delegate to other. For example, I want to access the system. Let my staff access the system. So instead of giving them, please take this seriously. Instead of giving them my username and my password, I delegate my role to them. The situation today, as of 2020, I'm still the head of IT in the university. I probably no longer be the head of the IT in the next 2 years, 2022, because my term is from 2018 and until 2022. So in 2022, I no longer be a head of IT, right? So instead of, disable my account and everything else, they simply take out the roles. From the identity. So I no longer be able to access the system that I'm enjoying at the moment. As I did mention, I have plenty of applications that I can access because I'm the head of IT today. The next 2 years, I won't be head of IT again. So, and I don't want to burden myself with the access of the system, right? Because I'm not the head of the IT anymore. For people in IT, they just simply check out my role in the authorization part, and then that's it. I'm still keeping my login. I'm still keeping my login page, my username, my password, but then I lost all the applications. And it's normal things for an enterprise. So think about that one, how difficult it is if you just simply use MySQL, you just simply use PostgreSQL, basically a relational database, to create some system like that. So in the campus identity access management, it has the registry of who, what kind of identifiers. For example, an identifier is something like, where are you from? Which department are you? Which affiliations are you? What course are you enrolled? And so on and so forth, right? And then for the authentication part, it can use internal database, or you can use cloud. It's really up to you, or something that link with your identity, right? So talking about that one, when we develop the IAM, we can simply use a local one. It's the most recommended one, or probably recommended using a local one, or the most common one. Yeah, the most common one, because you already have the infrastructure, so you keep everything locally. Or if you want, you can go to the cloud using the AWS, for example, using Google and everything else as an identity provider. Or as of today, now more and more organizations, they use federated. So apps aware of more than local and remote systems of record, now it starts to accept other identities based on trust. Yeah, based on trust. In fact, in our university, we extend the identity access management not only to the access management itself, the identity, but we also extend it into federations. So we can federate applications, we can federate users into multiple places, right? So some factors that need to be considered is actually the governance, who says, what kind of authorization that you have. Are you centralized, or are you distributed? Are you applications or data centric? How do you define the access? Is it based on the application base? Is it based on a user base? That means that only specific user can access things, right? Or based on process and practices and so on and so forth, right? So it's really high level abstractions. It's basically, how do you determine, how do you structure your identity? Again, to make things clear, identity is not only about authentications, but the rest of the things, right? So this is the evolution part. Long time ago, basically, for identity, it's only used for physical access, Wi-Fi, network, and everything else. It used to be hard-coded. In a text file, for example. So you have a list of username and password, but that was a long time ago. And now it started to evolve. Now it's changed to a lot of things. It's based on attributes, right? All right, so let's have a break. During the break, I'm not saying that let's drink some coffee, but I'll show you how it looks like so you won't get bored with my presentations. Let me open some website first, and I'll share my screen. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so on the screen, you see a website called, let me, okay, zoom in so you can see the website. Okay, I will speak enough. All right, cool. Okay, so this is a website from Australia, something called AAF, Australian Access Federations. I graduated from Australia, so I want to check my identity back in my campus, right? So my campus, my alma mater is the University of Queensland. It's located in Brisbane, and it's part of the AAF, Australian Access Federations, right? So if I click this, show me my attributes, right? I click this one, and I'll just simply access my university. Just simply type in Queensland, the University of Queensland. This is my university. Once I click the University of Queensland, the system will redirect itself, right? It will move to this website. As you can see over here, it's the University of Queensland, Australia. Oh, I think I clicked something. Okay, this is the University of Queensland, Australia, and then this is the login part that is owned by the University of Queensland. And then I click login. Right, this login website now return back to the AAF. This login website is now returned back to the AAF, right? As you can see over here, this is my email address. This is my first name. This is the organizations. This is my last name. And then I have the home organizations, uq.edu.au. And then this is my student number. This is my affiliations, alumni, blah, 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 and so on and so forth, right? So these are all the attributes. These are all the attributes that are available in my identity that is being released from the university. So all these attributes, AU, edu person, shared token, authentication method, display name, edu person, mail, given name, and everything else, all of them are the attributes coming from my university. Let me try if I can log in into the user again. Okay, zoom.us. Let's see if I can log in. Oh, sorry, I need to go with incognito. z.zoom.us. Let me change my screen. Hopefully I can still log in into the system. Just need to make sure. Okay, you can see the screen. I click sign in. So once I click the sign in part, it will ask me to log in. I just simply click login. Hopefully I'm still able to log in. Last time I still able to log in. I don't know about now. Okay. Right. Yay, I'm still able to log in, right? So as you can see over here, my profile here. So I can still use my account, blah, 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 with link account, SSO, meeting participant, like this, and like that. That's it, right? That's what happened with my UQ account. Now let's try to Science Direct. Long time ago, I can still access, but because I connected to the IP in UII, it shows something floaty. But let me try to sign in. Let's have a look. Student uq.edu.au. Right, so it now says the University of Queensland. sign in via your institutions. Usually I will got rejected because I'm no longer affiliated with the active students. I'm an alumni. Oh, I still can access. Brought to you by UQ Library. You see over here? It's my name here, and also UQ Library. I still able to access the journal and everything else from my university. So as you can see over here, this is something called the identity, right? So the Science Direct website is a service provider. Science Direct website is a service provider that use my credentials from my UQ account to identify myself as a user, right? And so it does the same thing with Zoom. Zoom is also a service provider. It's also a service provider. And Zoom wants to know whether I'm a legitimate user, I'm a valid user from the University of Queensland, right? Once I log in into the system, and then that's it. Okay, all is good. All right, I think I'll have a break for a minute or two, right? So we've been doing this for an hour plus. I don't want to, everybody just got tired looking at the screen. Okay, I'll return back to Fayruz.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Andi, for your explanation about identity federation. And then, yeah, Dr. Andri said that we have 1 minute break. If you have any questions, you can drop your question in the chat room. Or if you want to ask using Bahasa Indonesia, you can also ask using Bahasa. I'll try to translate your question to English. And after this, we'll have identity federation configuration demo, isn't it?
Yeah, hopefully. We still have plenty of things to do to explain.
Okay. We still have around 40 minutes.
Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me.
Okay, Wahluf Abidian has a question. He asked, using single sign-on is very profitable. However, what are the biggest threats when using single sign-on? How to assure potential users about fear of the threat?
Okay, hopefully I understand the questions. Here's the thing. Why we prefer identity management rather than SSO from Google, the OAuth one. If you are using, if you've seen my login page at UQ, let me show you again. So to grasp the idea of how to do things, I click this one, UQ login. I'll do the same thing with my, let me check. I'm still logged into the system. So, okay, log out. When I click login, I don't know whether they ask some question or not. Okay, log out. It should be, log on. Okay, now it has something this. Oh, okay, it doesn't ask the questions. Probably I'll just need to go with the AAF instead. AAF. Let's see. Then oh, okay. It didn't ask. Probably I just go with the UII. Let's see. I go with this website and then click sign in. Okay, so this is a few things that usually be displayed. Sorry if you are not from Indonesia, it's in Bahasa. So these things is basically something that a concern, right? Before you are releasing the data, because some informations might be a private issue. For example, probably someone will treat my email address my email address or my UID, my user ID, as a privacy things. Right? You probably in Indonesia, it's very common to give someone with a phone number, right? Because phone number is not considered to be a privacy issue in Indonesia. But if you are in Australia, if you are in US, it's uncommon for you guys to give someone's phone number, because phone number is something of private things, right? Different country has a different culture. If you go to Hong Kong, you might think that email is actually not a really private things. But for Hong Kong, the university in Hong Kong, they cannot give you their email addresses. They cannot give you email addresses as an attribute. So display name, edu person affiliations, edu person org unit, given name, mail, surname, this is something called attributes. In Hong Kong, the email attributes is not for everybody to see. So if you run a federations or an identity like this, you cannot simply send the email address to other parties. That's the challenge that happened in Hong Kong. When I spoke with a colleague from Hong Kong, Research Education Network, they did mention about this one. Email is something privacy. I was kind of like surprised back in the day. In fact, many other colleagues from Australia, from Europe, they also thought the same thing. Europe is very strict on privacy issues, but they never considered email as a privacy things, but not with Hong Kong, right? So when we use the SSO, definitely the threat is SSO. Once you log in into the system, you can log in all into other systems. But using something like this, something like Shibboleth, something like Concern, at least you are aware what kind of things that you are actually giving them. Like an example like this one, I'm trying to access my Panopto website. UII is subscribed to Panopto. I'm trying to access a Panopto website. So when you are accessing Panopto website, this is something that will be delivered to Panopto. This is something that will be delivered to Panopto. So the display name, the edu-person affiliations, the edu-person organizational unit, the given name, mail, surname, and UID is something that is needed by Panopto. But if you, for you guys from Universitas Islam Indonesia, you can try to log in into different platforms, Zoom, Panopto, and then you can also try to click classiper.uii.ac.id, try to log in using the SSO. You can see the difference among them. They will ask you different questions, different attributes. Like in this case, these are all the attributes that's needed. If you're accessing Zoom, they probably need different things, right? So these things, the attribute is actually something that at least now you know, I'm only giving this kind of information to the system, especially if you are going to some untrusted or you don't have the trust yet. So the threat is now, if you don't agree with the term, okay, I'm not accessing the website. So it provides you with the level of confidence. Basically, it's much better than the old way of SSO is doing. So the old way of SSO is doing is basically just simply log in into the system. Just think about logging into Google. You put your username and then you put the password, and then that's it. If you want to go to Bukalapak website, if you want to go to some most prominent Indonesian website using the Google platform, they will give you username, your email address. They will give you your first name and last name, and then that's it. You don't have any other information. But with this one, you can have the granularity. Okay, I provide with this kind of information, so I'm aware that the information that is being given to them is only this one. They don't provide with your, say for example, date of birth and everything else. They don't ask for that one in these situations. But probably in other systems, they will ask you the date of birth because, say, for voting purposes, you cannot vote unless you are 17 years old. Yeah, you can do that one as well, right? So that's the thing with security. Yeah. Okay, let's continue. So this is when we set up the identity provider for our campus. Consider stronger authentications, provide the multi-factor authentications, and then for vendor, basically this one, to let the identity provider handle the authentications. never have the authentications. Like if you saw the Science Direct website, if you saw Zoom website, if you saw Panopto website that you've just seen on your screen, the authentication is not on Zoom. The authentication is not on Panopto. The authentication is not on Science Direct, but the authentications is in the university, right? And then use only browser. Why a browser? Because you can simply remove the cookies, remove the cache, and everything else. And then do not use service-specific password. So basically, password is attached with your username. I mean, you as a person, not username, sorry, it's you as a person. You won't be given any default password. You won't be given any generic password. Your password is your life. That's why it's really important to treat username and password as your underwear. You know what I mean with the underwear? You don't show them to a public. You don't let other people to use your underwear, right? If you're using your underwear, you won't give your underwear to your friend. No way. There is no way that there is no chance that your friend will use your underwear. Treat the underwear like that. Never show. You use the underwear, but you never show. Or other analogy, probably treat username and password just like a toothbrush. For a toothbrush, you never share the toothbrush with others as well. You show the toothbrush, but you never share it with others, right? And then to use forced re-authentications, like the website that we just used just now, the Zoom and everything else, it usually will re-authenticate when appropriate, right? So that's how we do the thing with these identifiers, right? These are other things, set of identifiers, what kind of attributes that they provide for campus and vendor, use the standard definitions. If you are working with the research and education across the globe, they usually have the specific attributes, like the attribute as I've shown you just now, the edu person affiliation and everything else, it was a standard definitions. So people from across the globe, they sit together, they define what kind of attributes that we want to release each other, right? Okay, these are the attributes. I already mentioned about that one. It's basically the core that will improve the uptake of the federations, particularly for service provider, what kind of information that is needed from the service provider. This is an example. The UID, the ADU person unique ID, display name, given name, surname, title, email, and then group member, organization name, and so on and so forth. It really depends on us. You can release basically almost anything. So for us, if I want to create a software, I did this one actually a long time ago when I did my PhD back in Australia. I worked with my supervisor. I developed a software. So my supervisor, she has a class. It's an undergraduate class. And within that class, they need to practice the theory with some software. So they need to log in, the students need to log in into a particular system, into a specific system. So when I built the system, basically what happened was the authentication part, it's not handled by my software. So when I developed the software, I didn't do the authentication part. I didn't do the authorization part. What I did was, I have a system, and then I just simply create a requirement. Basically, I want to have the attributes. I simply create a requirement if the one that access my system, is a student who is currently enrolled into a particular course. So the course code was INFS 1200. So my system was only asking, are you enrolled in INFS 1200? That's the logic of the system. Of course, they won't ask the students. So when the students try to log into the system will redirect the login page into the university page. And then once they put the username and password, and they are enrolled in the current semester, they can access the system. Once they finish the semester, they move on to the next semester. When they try to log in, they will get rejected. So on my software that I develop, I don't need to put list of username list of users who can access the system. I don't care. I don't have the database. In fact, I don't have the database that consists of username. Only static users. For example, admin like myself. So I put my email and everything else. That's it. But that's only for few people. For the rest of the team, the rest of the group, the students, I don't have the database of the students at all, because the software, it's basically software where you can try the SQL query and everything else. So we want students to access the system, but we don't want students who is not enrolled in the current semester into that particular course to access the system. Only specific students that can access the system. That's something really helpful with these identity federations, right? Probably some issue happens like security, privacy, and everything else. So before we release the attributes, we need to make sure that the attribute is okay. Like I did mention, if you are in Hong Kong, definitely you won't release any email. If you are in Australia, you probably don't need to release an attribute called phone number. Right? I had a discussion last time with National Library of Indonesia when I talk about these identity federations. They want me to release the national identity number, right? In Bahasa Indonesia, it's NIK. So the national identity number, they want them. They want the numbers before user can access the system. That's something that we really need to think a lot, right? So the attribute is basically everything in identity, right? Attribute is basically everything. Yeah. Good thing is we can always introduce new attributes. We don't have to follow the certain attributes. Of course, we need to follow certain attributes if you are working closely with other research education network across the globe. But if you have your own system, you want to create a specific system for yourself, you can definitely define your own attribute, right? That's a good thing about this IDP, the identity management, right? So this is how the building blocks of federations. Once we have the identity, we need to set up few things. First, what kind of attributes that you will keep. Second is who is the identity provider. Third one is who is the service provider. So on a federations, if this is a federations need to define what kind of attributes that you are going to handle. Federations need to define who are the identity provider. Again, think identity provider as the one that holds your username and password. In the case of research and education network, usually the identity provider will be universities. Those will be universities. And then service provider, like e-journals, Zoom, Moodle, and everything else. And then we have also the discovery. You saw that discovery before when I show you the Australian Access Federation website. I type in my university name, the University of Queensland, and then it will pop up with the name of the university. Also the federation tools, we will have the demo of this one for this with something called Jagger, right? So it's Jagger, the one that we use. And then we have all the metadata. Metadata is basically all kind of information that is needed for both identity provider and also the service provider. It will be collected in there, and also the policy, right? For identity providers, it's basically like a phone book where you have the name and everything else, right? It provides you with a login page, provide a mechanism for consent of release attributes. And you saw it when someone log into our university system, they will provide you with the attributes that's going to be released. And then it's usually being branded. You see the logo and everything else. Usually it's authenticates against LDAP, Open LDAP, or probably AD. In our case, in Universitas Indonesia, we use the AD. And then manage password resets, provisioning, deprovisioning account, when you enable, disable account. And then basically you need to agree with the federation policies. For an SP is usually run by organization that has something to offer. For example, the Zoom or the e-resources. So a university can be IDP and also at the same time can be SP. Okay. For university, it can work as IDP if you act as an identity provider, but you can also as an SP, service provider, if someone needs resources from you, right? So basically the service provider is the one that receive the authentications from the IDP, right? It obtains attributes from IDP and also agreed to federation policies. This is discovery. You saw this one where we can type in and then all the IDP will be listed, right? We've printed this part. This is the metadata. This is how it looks like. Let's see whether we can see. This is not so good picture actually. It's basically, this is the certificate and everything else. So the metadata contains all informations that you have on IDP and SP. Now let's have a look for the federated identity. What is a federated identity? Basically, it's kind of like a virtual organizations. It's a virtual organizations. So for federated identity, I'll just put a block here. It will have something called IDP. This IDP, where University A, say I wrote as UA, and then UB, and then UC is part of the member. And then we have all the SP, the service provider, where we have all the services. I put services 1, services 2, and then services 3. Like I mentioned before, instead of the services dealing one by one, so I have to deal with this guy, I have to deal with this guy, I have to deal with this guy. Instead of doing that, I just need to deal with my federated identity. The federated identity will be the one that will direct me to the service provider, right? So we act as an virtual organizations and research group, right? So there are many things happen in the university, like collaboration tools for science, like storage and retrieval, version control, using Git and everything else. In fact, in Sri Lanka, they have something called Learn, Sri Lanka Research Education Network. When they want to use Zoom, basically in whole Sri Lanka, there's only one Zoom for research educations. So unlike in Indonesia, for example, our university has its own subscription to Zoom, and then other university also has subscription to Zoom. And then my login page, our login page is uii.zoom.us. And in Australia, you just saw it has uqz.zoom.us, and so on and so forth. So each and every university will have their own identity provider. But in Sri Lanka, the way they work with Zoom is the one that subscribed to Zoom is only one institution, and that institution is called Learn. So Learn is actually a research education network in Sri Lanka. So Learn subscribe to Zoom, and the rest of the universities, so they have 10 or 20 university as part of Learn network. This university, when they want to log into Zoom, they don't need to log in into their own university identity. They just simply log into Learn, and then on Learn, let me show you if I can share it on the screen. Learn Zoom Sri Lanka. Hold on, let me check whether I have the link. Video conferencing system. Okay, let me share the screen. All right, this is the screen. I hope this is in the incognito. Okay, and then you see the URL here is learn.zoom.us. Let me try to click my account. Oh, I need to log out first. I still go with my UQ account. Let me type in learn.zoom.us. Here you go. As you can see over here, Lanka Educations and Research Network. And then when I click sign in, this is how it looks like, the login page. It goes to the identity federations, and then we just need to type in the name of the university. Right? For example, I'm going with the Eastern University Sri Lanka, and then I click continue. See, the login page just goes here, right? So that's how we do things with the federation as well, right? Let me return back to my PowerPoint. Okay, this is something that we have, right? Storage retrieval, version control, search, and calendar context, and everything else. And this is to fix these things. This is an example, traditional approach for collaborations. We have a cloud Google Docs where you have Gmails for our personal use. It's very common. I'm working in some institutions, but then I give them my Gmail account to access. So rather than Gmails, why don't we use our institutional identity? So having a situation like that, it's easier if we share all the things. This is another example with the SharePoint, Microsoft. So it's better if we have something like this. So all the login, we just simply log in with the virtual office collaboration tools, right? So rather than log in into each particular system, we just simply use a federated identity, right? So why federated identity? Why not Google? Why not Facebook? Why not Twitter? So let's have a look at the Google policy. Information we collect when you are signed into Google, in addition to information obtained about you from partners, may be associated with your Google account. When information is associated with your Google account, we treat it as a personal. So basically, the one that owns the data is Google. So federated identity has more benefit. For example, once it's verified affiliations. You are the one from a university, so you are the guy. We believe you because you can log in into the system. Second part is it's a unique, it's verified information about user states. Unlike in Google, where you can just simply put any names, but in university, it is really you. You know, in university, you cannot simply create some dummy and then dummy users and then just simply okay, right? Because it will be audited, right? And then it's accurate and up-to-date information. Like I did mention, if you are an alumni, you cannot log into the system because it's up-to-date. But you're still able to log in into other systems as well, right? It's normal for an alumni to access their own educational information system. I want to see my transcripts. I want to see everything else. So as an alumni, I'm still able to access the whole system, but not a particular system, right? We can group information for students, staff, employees, and alumni, and then we have the automated verification of the status, and then we reduce the overhead for user support because now we don't need as an SP, again, as an SP, we don't need to create our own login page. I repeat again, as an SP, I don't need to create my own login page, right? So no need to support per service username and password. Think like Zoom. When someone forget the password from my university, he or she won't ask Zoom. He or she will ask the IT support. So it's easier for user to manage smaller number of credentials, use support by the campus, reduce integration efforts. Once you have the identity, do once and then reuse in many places. That's what happened with our identity, right? So the benefits, first, it's managing personal data, bring risk and responsibility. It's something that we need to think deep, right? So like I mentioned, when you work with some people from Europe, think about that one carefully. So rather than having the data, why don't just you simply ask them to log in into their own particular system, and then once it's authenticated, authorized, it can access your resource. So we reduce the risk of fines for mismanagement of the data, you know, the GDPR things, and then we minimize personal data held locally. So again, we only keep the data that we need. We don't need to keep data everything. All right, so now the most important, interesting part is the deployment part. Yay, finally. We'll need the help from my colleague, Mbak Linda from Badan Sistem Informasi from Port Information System. Once I explain about this one. So how do we deploy these identity federations, right? So this is an example in our university. Right? We have these services, Office 365, Zoom, Google, Moodle, and Opto, right? We treat them as service provider, right? For your informations, these are not only our service provider. We have plenty of service provider registered in our system. And then we use something called Jagger. So this is a federated identity. It's a federation. So running federation in Indonesia, we also use the same software called Jagger. So the Jagger website that we have in Federasi, federasi.id, is actually the one that manages all the identity provider. So in the case of our university, we can accept identity for more than one, right? So we can accept identity from other universities as well, like the case with Sri Lanka, where you can subscribe to some services, and basically the one that subscribe to the services is not the university, but the umbrella of the organization itself, right? So we are the federations where we register all of these. These are all SPs, and then we have the shibboleth as our IDP. With the backend, this is the good thing about the IDP. Our backend consists of Active Directory, MySQL using the program MySQL, and also we still keep the old database that we have Oracle database. So the shibboleth that we use has plenty of data source. But to the Jagger, to these federations, the federation is only seeing one source, the shibboleth that we use, right? And the shibboleth that we use is basically using a SAML. It's a SAML-based authentications. It's a security assertion markup language. Basically, it's an open standard for exchanging authentications and authorizations data between parties, in particular between identity provider and service provider. As you can see over here, the service provider, it requests something like this, requests protected resources. And then we have the SAML ITP, where we should display the login page. And remember, we can also use this one to access a server, to access even physical resources, right? And then credential send for verifications with the user database. And then we create a verification response, whether it's okay, it's a user from this company, these research applications, and so on and so forth. Once you finish with all that thing, and then that's it. You can access the system, right? So this is how it looks like. We'll give you the demo just after this. This is an example how we register a identity provider and how we register, sorry, this is the identity provider and this is the service provider. The step-by-step, I'll give you the PDF of these slides to the committee. So the committee will probably will deliberate on the ICITDA website, right? So this is what you need to do, the identity management and also the identity federations. First thing first, prepare the user directory. You can use Microsoft Active Directory, or you can use OpenLDAP. Or if you don't want to use that one, you can simply use MySQL, Postgre. It's basically some preferable database that you can use. But I'm suggesting not to use the database, relational database like MySQL or Postgre. It's better to use the directory, something like Microsoft Active Directory or OpenLDAP. Once you have the Active Directory and OpenLDAP website up and running, and then we install the IDP. We can use the shibboleth IDP, CAS, or simple SAML PHP. If you know nothing about the IDP, probably the easiest way is to run simple SAML PHP. This is the most simple one, right? It's just few 100 kilobytes. It's run on PHP. So if you are with PHP, it's good for you. The configuration part is also simple, but simple SAML is not as extensive as shibboleth. If you ask why UII, no, it's not using simple SAML, we moved to shibboleth because of the enrichment. Simple SAML, it's, as the name says, simple. It's really simple, right? In shibboleth, we can mix the source of informations, not only from the directory, but also from the database as well. So like I mentioned, if I want to specify some specific user from some specific semesters or from some specific grades, for example, we can use ShipOS, but not with a single sign-on, right? If you like to use the IDP, make sure that it's a SAML-based authentications. Everything I mentioned here is a SAML-based authentications. We definitely can use applications that is a service provider. So the SP, for the SP, next time when you develop a website or develop an applications, make sure it's a SAML-based authentications. Or if you subscribe to a vendor, before you subscribe to a vendor, you can simply ask them, do you support SAML-based authentications? If they don't support SAML-based authentications, then it's so yesterday. Do not subscribe to that vendor. So for example, a vendor provide you with some software access for enterprise. Ask them, always ask to accept SAML-based authentications. If they don't, go with another vendor. But for most vendor, big vendor today, like Microsoft, like Google and everybody else, they always support the SAML-based authentications, right? And then once you install the IDP, once you have the SP, if you have the service, SP is optional. You only deploy SP only if you deliver resources. Only if you deliver a resource. If you don't deliver a resource, no need to install the SP, right? And the last part is deploy the Jaeger. Install Jaeger from TNet as a bridge to connect IDP and SP, and then that's it. The rest you can read this one. And now let's have a look with the demo. But show me the Jaeger website. Mbak Linda, bisa ditunjukkan Jaegernya? Oh, I think she.
Mr. Rian, can you give a co-host to Ms. Linda, please?
Okay, wait a minute. Kembali nanti buka Jaegernya ya.
Okay. Sorry, Dr. Anda.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I still on mute. So now you can see on the screen, this is the web that we use as our federations. This is something called as Jaeger, right? You can install Jaeger on Linux. You can install on Windows. If you are using Linux, you can use Ubuntu as your base, or you can use CentOS. Many tutorials usually only deal with Ubuntu or CentOS, but it's basically any kind of distribution is fine. But if you use CentOS or if you use Ubuntu, you have a lot of friends, right? So as you can see on the screen, on top of the menu, you see different type of them. The first one is something called federations. And then we have the identity providers. And then we have also the service providers. That's the three things that you need to see, right? So the federations is basically, like I mentioned many times during the workshop, is the one that manage all the informations, the bridge that happened. So if I have Mbak Linda, di enable annotate, Mbak. Di atas. Di zoom-nya di atas nanti ada enable annotations.
Sudah, Pak.
Sudah ya. Okay. Right. So as you can see over here, we have three things: federations, identity providers, and also service providers, right? First thing first, once you install the Jaeger, you need to create something called federations. In this case, we already have something workshop federations, right? And then for the name in metadata, you should follow this schematic, this URN, dot maze dot, you can name anything afterwards. So it's basically a standard of how to name our federations, right? These federations will act as the bridge. So I wrote this one. This will be the bridge that connects two things. The first one is the identity provider. The second one is service provider, right? So now let's have a look into the federation. But click workshop federation. But right. So as you can see over here, we already registered two things. The first one is actually the identity provider. So this is the identity provider, and this is the service provider. But click membership. But right. So in the membership, let's have a look. This is the test website that we created a few days ago. This one is the identity provider, and this one is the service provider. As you can see over here, we just simply put random name AAAA, and then this is the IDP Universitas Islam Indonesia. Let's have a look in actions. Mbak dibuka SP Engine X, Mbak, untuk demo. Let's have a look in actions. All right, as you can see over here, we have the URL over here. We open a website spenginex.uii.ac. It's just simply a test website. And then once we log into the system, it will be forwarded to this idp.uii.ac.id. And then this is where we input our username. Click login. Okay, once we log in, we have this page. Welcome to Nginx, a simple page. Mbak Lina, can you show me on the Nginx configurations, the page, how can you SSH di SSH ke servernya, Mbak, ditunjukkan konfigurasi ini, halaman website ini. Share the screen of the terminal, Mbak, setelahnya. Okay. This is where we define a website and SP. This is where we define a website and SP. As you can see over here, this is the metadata that we have as an SP. We use Shibboleth. We use Shibboleth to create the SP, the service provider. As you can see over here, let's have a look. Let me put an annotate first, right? So this is where we set up everything. This is the host name, and then it's based on the Shibboleth. And then once we have the things, we have this SSO as our IDP, right? So we set up these things, the informations that we have on the Shibboleth, right? Okay, yang halaman Nginx-nya, Mbak. Ya. Di Nginx atau di sites enabled, Mbak? Di sini. Oh, sorry, tadi kayaknya di atas ada. Mana yang default tag? Jadi di default kayaknya, Mbak. Let's have a look. Nginx. Yeah. All right. So it should be something called Shibboleth. So the resource over here is being protected by Shibboleth. Sebelah mana, Mbak, yang bikin Shibboleth-nya? Okay, please highlight. Okay. So that resources is basically we need to pass that one into Shibboleth responder. So when we create a website, we just simply create a website. It's normal, nothing unusual. It's just we need to configure that we gonna have the secure locations with the authentication using a shibboleth, right? So we just simply create configurations in our Nginx page, and we can do that one in Apache, in Large HTTPD. Basically, that's how we do things. And then once we put a security part onto that page, before we can access into that page, it will be blocked by shibboleth authentications, right? So let's go back, Mbak, ke checker. Let's go back to the checker. Okay, let's go back to the checker. Now we can see over here that we have the IDP and also the SP that's being populated. Once we populate the IDP and SP metadata, Mbak. Now we have something called metadata. Dibuka Mbak yang sign. Alright, in the metadata bisa dicarikan Mbak membernya. Okay. Once we have this metadata, as you can see over here, we have the membership, the SP that we have that is being registered to the Jaeger is this one, the SP Nginx, right? And we also have the identity provider. Okay, tadi di atas, Mbak, scroll ke atas. MyDB. Okay, that's the one. This is the identity provider. As you can see over here, when we have this shibboleth, when we have this metadata is used by the SP. So we're gonna have a lot of IDP here. Over here, we're gonna have a lot of IDP. And now I'm as an SP. For example, I'm a site website, and I want to see what are the universities available under Indonesia Access Federations. Again, I need to repeat, I'm a Science Direct website, and I want to see what are the universities in Indonesia that can act as an IDP provider. So rather than me as a Science Direct, I set up one by one. The metadata came from all those universities. I simply use the data that I have from the federations. So once I have all the metadata in the federations, I can reuse the metadata to any service provider. So the metadata can be used by the Science Direct, the metadata can be used by EBSCO, can be used by IEEE and everybody else. They just simply look into, okay, this university, my member is part of the federations in Indonesia. And then that's it. So we don't have to redefine all the metadata. We just simply collect the metadata from the Jaeger. So now the Jaeger is the federation itself. So if you want to use the metadata from these federations, it's basically once you need to subscribe to the federations. So you'll be part of the federations. If you are an SP, you also need to be part of the member of the federations. Once you join, we can simply connect using the federations, using this one. And again, federations doesn't have to be national-wide. You can also simply use the federations in your own institutions. Like in the case with the Universitas Islam Indonesia, since many departments, they have their own system, we provide them with the login page. So we treat them as an SP. And then they can use the IDP from us. So when they build a website, they don't need to worry about the login page. They don't need to worry about the authentication part. What they need to worry is the authorization part. Who will be using my system? Who is allowed to access my system? And so on and so forth. All right, I think that's all. We've been doing this for like 2 hours. But Linda, you can close the chat screen. Yeah, I return back to Fayruz. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Andri and Miss Linda for the demo. And from the participants here, if you have any question, if you want to talk directly to Dr. Andri, you can use the raise hand feature and we will unmute you, or you can drop your question in the chat room. Actually, I have a question. In the beginning of the workshop, you mentioned about Indonesia Access Federation or federasi.id. And I think it's a little bit similar to EduRoam. Okay, why do we need federasi.id? Can we just use eduroam and then use the attribute, for example, check if user from Indonesia and give the access or something like that. Why do we need a new community for this federasi.id?
Okay, so eduroam, like I mentioned, it's usually for physical resources. It's for network resources. Eduroam work in 802.1x situations, and especially it's running for Wi-Fi. So you can use Wi-Fi. You can access the Wi-Fi based on the authentications that is being done in layer 2. So eduroam is for layer 2. If you remember, in the network we have the 7 layer. Layer 2 is the data link. The solo the data link is being authenticated using eduroam access. For identity federations, we authenticate more on high level. So it runs on layer 7. It's for applications. It's for applications. So that's why we run it on browser base. Yeah, we run it on browser base. Usually, most common one is on browser base. So before we can SSH the server, usually like that, we simply authenticate ourselves on browser base, and then this is very common example for a server. How we run a server, and then we use the federations. The server is only accepting public key. It doesn't accept username and password, right? For those who is not familiar, if you SSH a server, usually you will be asked for a username and password. But usually using a federations, you don't use a username and password, but instead you'll be using your own public key. So how do we get the public key? Is basically by logging into a web server. Now, when you log into the web server, you use your credentials from your own institutions, from your own university. So for example, I'm going to use HPC server that is available on Australia, and we have a collaboration with Australia. Basically, I can use the system. So what happened is when I open their website to generate my public key, it will be redirected back to my university, and then I log into my university. Once I log into my university, it will be returned back to the website over there, and then they will provide me with the public key. So I can use that public key to access the server. So I can SSH the server. So yes, in a way, eduroam and access federations has the similar concept where you can use other resources, other institution resources using your own credentials. But the different thing is, eduroam for layer 2, right? It's for physical resources. You need to be there to use the eduroam. You need to be in, for example, University of WA, Western Australia, or you need to be in University of Tokyo, or you need to be in National University of Singapore before you can access the eduroam over there. But using these federations, you can access resources from NUS, for example, from Indonesia. You try to log in into the NUS website, it will be redirected back to your institution website, and then it will be returned back again to NUS website. Once you've done that part, you can now start to access the data. Hopefully it's clear enough.
Okay, thank you for your explanation. So we need different moderations for that, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of like that.
Okay, so why Universitas Islam Indonesia try to gather, I think, another universities? Why don't the Indonesia Research and Education Network, or IDREN, try to create this federasi.id?
Okay, it's simple, because the one that run eduroam is usually the one that run federations. And since the one that active in the community is me, so that's why people from across the globe, they only know me. So they know me very well as a person, as a personal, right? So, you know, in research education network community, it's really essential to each other as an individual, as a personal, not only as an institutions. So since they know me very well as a person, and also part of the IDN, since I'm also part of the IDN, so that's why they, when we set up the identity, when they want Indonesia to set up identity federations, the one that they know is me. So that's why we developed the Access Federation. That's it. Very simple.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Andri. I think we have answered all of the questions. And Dr. Andi, is there anything else you would like to mention, like closing statement? No. Okay.
No.